All right, so speaking of the big picture here, what we want to think about is how are the French, how are the British, how are the Spanish going to be similar in their objectives and their degrees of success and their interactions with the Native Americans, and in what ways are they different and why? And this should sound familiar to you because yesterday we started free-writing and created a thesis about this very same question. So now we're going to get a little bit more information about that to talk about it. So here's a pretty cool image that I'm actually, Mr. Park, could you turn that light on for me? That I'm actually going to show you here. So, there we go. What do we notice about this picture? All right, there's Cristobal Columbus, that's right. What else? Spain, okay, España, either, whatever, okay. What else do we have? Yeah, they've got some weapons, he's holding a sword. There, yeah, good job, guys. So, look, here's my super awesome magic trick. This is what teachers get excited about these days. You guys ready? You see the Native Americans over here?
What?
Yeah.
On the paper.
On the paper, I know. Look, it's magic. So they're hiding, right? They're there. At first glance, did you notice the Native Americans?
No.
No, you had to look pretty carefully. They're kind of hidden over here. They're right. Somebody said fearful. Yeah. This guy's bowing down in awe. I'm sure that would be everybody's reaction to this contingent. What else do you notice? They are pretty cool. Look at that.
Jesus.
Well, I don't think that's a crucifix because it's a cross. But yeah, sure, Jesus. There's something about God, golden glory there. What's over here? Yes, the sun. What else? Thanks for that. Boats, yeah. Water, right? So this is sort of an odd picture in this. And students, if you haven't looked at a lot of pictures or depictions of like the European landing in America, you might not have noticed this, but this picture's kind of backwards, right? Because don't we normally think of the left side as the west and this side as the east? But they came from the east to the west, you know, like they sailed westward across the Atlantic. So the picture's kind of backwards in terms of like where they place the water. What about like the mood of the painting? Yes, I think that is a great. Did I tell you my story about Nate and the word glorious?
No.
It's a good one. The other day Nate discovered the word glorious. I didn't know who taught him the word glorious, but we were getting ready to go to school, and I was like, Nate, let's go. And he goes, with my glorious pencil. All right, Nate, good job. And then we get to, you know, South Knoll or whatever, and we're walking into school. And his teacher's like, hey, Nate, come on, it's going to be a great day. And he goes, no, it will be a glorious day. And his teacher is like, all right. Yeah, so I think this one is a glorious picture. If I thought that was pretty good. I think that's a pretty good word. Thanks for that, Nate. So this picture kind of gives us a hint about how the Spanish perceive their arrival, right? They are sort of destined to be here. They have God on their side. They're coming clearly to conquer. They have plenty of men in support of them. They're carrying the Spanish flag. All of those things are important to understand. Here's a little bit of a different picture. Take a second to glance over it. I like this one better. All right, what are some things we notice? There's a cross. Yeah, this one really is the crucifix, right? And it's being erected. Here, they're putting it in the ground. The water's on the right side. The natives aren't quite as subservient looking. Right? They're not quite as looking like quite scared creatures. You know, there's some proud native men, but then the women are cowering. How are the natives dressed? Yeah, well, by European standards at least, it's kind of scandalously, right? So, very or there's a very strong contrast between the way that the natives are drawn and the way that the Spanish are drawn. What else?
The sun's shining on the natives, not the Europeans.
All right, so the light choice here is a bit different. We can still see they're bringing a lot of weapons, big military force behind the Spanish. Here's a big cannon for the Native Americans who had never seen, had never used gunpowder. I think a cannon would be really terrifying, much less guns. Again, lots of people who are coming. We have, here is a priest praying like for the blessing on this new venture. So just kind of practice, one of the kinds of source material that could appear on the AP exam are images. And so we want to be able to pick out some of those details and identify some historical support for the painting. Both of these images, of course, were created by who? Not an individual person. I have no idea. This is not our history. Yeah, somebody European for sure, and probably somebody Spanish, right? So the perspective is pretty clear there. So when we're talking about the Spanish, we've already gone into the details of the encomienda system, and we've talked about how the encomienda system is really a way to organize settlement in the New World. The Spanish came with the idea that they want to have, that they want to benefit from the resources of the New World, that they want to have permanent settlements, and the encomienda system is a way to do that, even when, for the first century or so, there's not that many Spanish families coming, right? After the New World gets better settled, and it's sort of more formalized, well then, Spanish families will come, we'll begin to see a gender balance improve, that kind of thing. But early on, mostly they're going to be young men, the conquistadors, they're going after, whatever, glory in their own way. And then they will intermarry with native women, and of course that in itself is unique of the Spanish. The Catholic Church is going to play a large role, both socially, politically, and culturally. So this is not a theocracy. The church is not the government. There are separate Spanish bureaucrats. The Spanish crown is separate from the head of the church in Spain. But there is a lot of coordination. So there will be laws that require religious activity. The social makeup of the community, the cultural norms, these are going to stem from Catholic traditions. You can see in the middle here some of the influence. We're going to talk about this is a mestizo couple, but you can see some of the influence of the Catholic Church. The woman is wearing a mantilla, a veil, like a chapel veil. They're going to church in this picture. We've already mentioned that the Spanish are going to use intermarriage sort of by necessity, because lots of Spanish women aren't coming to the New World, and they're settling and they're staying here a long time and establishing these settlements. But also, sort of over time, it becomes part of the cultural development of the colony. And although sort of at the tippy top of the social spectrum, we've got these like super pure-blooded Spaniard people from Spain, there is a very large and accepted portion of society that involves mestizo, mixed-race people, the product of a marriage, so a sacramental marriage. They're still involved in the church. The church blesses these kinds of unions. A marriage between a white Spaniard and a Native American here. And then, of course, the Spanish are going to be enormously profitable. Silver is one part of that story. Sugarcane and other agricultural goods sort of tell the rest. But there are bountiful silver mines throughout the Spanish territories in the New World, and this is a really big deal because for about a century or so, the North American colonies are going to allow Spain to become the dominant power in Europe, right? It won't last forever. You probably know that eventually Spain takes on England and the divine wind scatters the Spanish Armada, and the English manage to start their own growth. The English will dominate then as we move into the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But certainly the Spanish are going to have that sort of first hint of glory here, and it's in many ways funded by their exploration. But the French have a very different story. Unlike the Spanish, there are no large royally organized jaunts to the New World. In fact, the very first to claim any land or territory for France are just kind of some loners, right? Some individuals who gather up enough kind of like-minded people. They set out on their own with very few resources, really just enough kind of to get them in a ship and across the ocean. They show up, kind of want to figure out, what they can find. They encounter some Native Americans. They realize that the furs that they can find where they land, which is of course what we would call Canada, are really valuable. And then their sort of tales of success are going to draw some other like-minded people. Almost never are we going to see, for the first almost century of French development, are we going to see families coming to the New World. Really, the French don't begin to see like communities of people coming, creating villages and towns and developing sort of like transplanting French culture. That really doesn't come until, I don't know, about 1700, right? So this is going to be almost a century later. And so then really the French only have, 50 or 60 years or so worth of development before they're defeated by the British in the French and Indian War. And then France loses her claims to essentially all territory in North America. So the French really, the story of French settlement is a reality. There will be settlements in like modern day Quebec. The French will have small inroads in Texas. I don't know if you remember Texas history, but La Salle comes, and explores Texas a bit. But because of the lack of resources, because the French are much more concerned with their hegemony on the European continent, the French are never going to send enough to really expand their territory in any significant sense. So the story of the French really then is a story of explorers who cooperate with Native American tribes. They form alliances. The French have fairly few problems with the Native Americans, but the French only begin to see conflict with Native Americans when the British begin to arrive in North America, and the British and their allies will begin to try to challenge the French for some of that territory, sort of contesting the border like between New York and what we would call Canada. That comes later. Of course, so like here's Champlain, who is going to claim the most territory for France. They're going to try to find a Northwest Passage. None of that's really particularly successful. Okay, there we go. So then we've got England. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask about the French. Is that this is sort of a general question, but if the French were driven out of the northernmost Americas, then what is the ethnic, the sort of ancestry of Canadians today, as far as what kind of people were they if the French were
French and British. So just because, we'll get to this later, but when I say that the French are driven out of North America, I mean French government. But the French people are still in Quebec, and they have pretty low population density, but they're still definitely there. And the British then have this puzzle of how are they going to govern them, and that's going to be a problem that will anger the American colonists, and we'll get to all of that later. Yes, Ben?
I call them England and not Great Britain.
Because it's shorthand. Also, I mean, they're not really Great Britain until they have an empire, right? And they begin to conquer the Scots and the Irish, and then they can be the Great Britain overall, all that. Yep. Nothing. That we're talking about the same place. But the names sort of deal or respond to the varying levels of conquest of England. So England itself is if you can see the island of what you think of as England in your head, the northernmost part is actually Scotland, and then there's England, so that's England. Great Britain is going to refer to the political unification of England, Scotland, and Ireland, or at least part of Ireland. And then the United Kingdom can then go okay. So then here come the British or the English, or you pick the word you want because it's not really that big of a difference or that big of a deal here. The British are going to get into the game pretty late. And it has a lot to do with a really slow consolidation of power in England. You might remember or know from world history that in England we're going to see things like the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, Petition of Right, and so on. And those documents are really symbolic of how much power the individual nobles still had in England as compared to elsewhere, where the kings of France and the king of Spain were able to consolidate their control more quickly. In England, the king is not, the monarchy is not as successful at sort of like creating this ultimate authority. England is going to have a constitutional monarchy dating back to the 13th century. That means that they have limited government. So one of the keys we're going to find then to successful colonization or to successful exploration is significant royal support. It's sort of like this unending source of wealth that can buffer and aid and send reinforcements to the New World if and when they are necessary. But that's not really the case in England. And even when we begin to see English settlement, they still don't have that sort of second precondition of like the support from the king. The British monarchy isn't really going to be paying attention to the New World colonies until the middle of the 1600s. And so really we're going to see several decades of early English settlements that don't have a lot of British support at all. And the British aren't going to really be active in trying to govern their colonies. They're going to kind of like pretend they want to govern the colonies, but they're not going to be active in governing the colonies until really the French and Indian War, which is another century after that, right, in the 1750s. And so this sort of talks about some of the political differences between England and France and Spain. But eventually the British are going to get ready. So Henry VIII is going to be a bit of a turning point in Great Britain by consolidating power in the monarchy, by breaking with the church. So now there's not two sort of sources who can claim divine right, that kind of business. He's going to begin to make the shift in England to a more centralized bit of authority. Of course, when Elizabeth I is queen, as she reigns as monarch, we're going to see that really strong rivalry between Britain and Spain. Again, you probably remember that story from world history. Now there's a really great movie about it that sort of ends with the Spanish trying to invade England. They think they can do it because the British don't seem to be that strong. And they send the Armada. The Spanish Armada was, of course, the greatest naval force in the entire world at the time. They had never been defeated. And then they come to England and a storm blows them off course and scatters them, and like a whole bunch of British, like, nobody ships, you know, fishing vessels and whatever, are able to sort of pick off the remaining armada. And England feels like it was a Protestant win, you know, like the Protestants beat the Catholics, and that's supposed to be like God telling them they're right or something. Anyway, that's another turning point then that is going to sort of create some of that missionary zeal even within England, right? The English church that is the Church of England, right? So no longer the Catholic Church, they've broken away. The Church of England is going to get sort of renewed vim and vigor. They're going to begin like enforcing sort of religious laws about like how to worship and when to worship and those kinds of things with a bit more enthusiasm. And that in and of itself is going to have some ramifications, right? We know with the Pilgrims and the Puritans and how they have problems with this like renewed activism of the Church of England. But anyway, then I read this book several years ago that talked about the British practice run. It was like, you know, so how did the British get ready for conquest? You know, what was their experience? Of course, the Spanish had the Reconquista, right? They had fought the Moors. This is like helps their military to like gain some experience, but also like informs how they see like the other and the enemy, and is going to be impactful on the way that they settle here. But so what's going on with the British? And this author made an argument that I'm not sure I 100% buy, but I think it's interesting enough to present to you. The author made the argument that it was actually the British conquest of Ireland that really sets them up for and kind of is a precedent that they're going to follow along when they get to North America. There is absolutely brutal conquests in Ireland. Sort of take no prisoners, lie, cheat, and steal to gain the advantage, and then absolutely exploit the weaknesses of the enemy. Total domination, so the Irish people are going to be forced into subservience. We're like 150 years early for this, but you guys have probably heard of the Irish potato famine. Well, the Irish potato famine happens because there's this fungus that infects the potatoes in Ireland, and so like the crop doesn't grow, and like, you know, millions of Irish people starve to death and or like sacrifice themselves to try to get to America. The thing is that nobody ever really remembers, there wasn't actually a famine in Ireland at the time. There was plenty of food in Ireland, but the rules in Ireland went that all of the other food that was being grown was for the English. So the English kind of had, plantation's not the right word, but it's a sort of okay visual for you to use now. The English had plantations in Ireland, so that there would be an English lord who would control a big piece of land. and that land would be farmed, and food would be created, and most of it would then be sent to England, right? And some of it would be enjoyed by the English lords there in Ireland. But the Irish peasants, the people who were forced to work on this land, they were only allowed to work these really small plots, and on these tiny plots they were given really the only food that they could grow, the only like seeds they were given, the only thing that could even attempt to support them on such a small like plot of land was potatoes, right? We're talking about how they're calorie dense and so on, all this business. Well, anyway, so when they don't have potatoes, then they don't have any food, right? But there's plenty of food in Ireland. So one of the great tragedies of the Irish potato famine is that, like, if the English had just shared the food they were producing in Ireland, there would have, like, nobody would have been starving. But that's not how it went. Anyway, so we shouldn't be surprised then when next week we talk about the relationships between the English and the Native Americans. I'm going to give you a spoiler alert here. It's real bad, okay? There's no such thing as cultural accommodation or like even pretending to be even-sided alliances, none of those things. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised given how the British responded to the Irish. But in any case, as we begin to see the English making some inroads in North America, so first with the Virginia Company, as you know, the goal of the Virginia Company was to make money, right, to make a profit. So we begin to see that. Then we've got the Puritans in New England, and they are trying to develop this shining city on a hill, you know, where they're going to be a beacon of like religious righteousness for the world. And they're becoming more successful. As all of this happens, it turns out that maybe there's a profit to be made from, you know, getting a charter from the King of England and then trying to get people to come and settle. Well, nobody wants to settle if they find out that people are like resorting to, you know, cannibalism and eating leather and being raided and massacred by Native Americans on the frontier. That's not a particularly rosy picture. So we actually begin to see some like early propaganda where people, Richard Hakluyt is one of the first. That's the like document that you see there. So this guy who never saw the New World, but he's hired to write a book about it, and he writes this book about like how gentle the people are, and the land is so fertile that, you know, without any effort at all, the crops just spring forth from the ground and provide this bounteous harvest, and so on and so forth. And people read this, and England, of course, which is the first country really in Europe to experience population pressure, right? It's a tiny island. And so they're beginning to be overcrowded. We've got the enclosure movement with like agriculture, that's not important. Anyway, the English are struggling with having enough territory and food for their people. So people go, ooh, that sounds awesome, let's go. And then they arrive in America, and are we surprised if they are really ill prepared for what they find? Maybe not, right? So a lot of the early English attempts in North America are pretty disastrous. But it has a lot to do, again, they were not organized, they were not well financed, they are very divided. There's no like unification even in North America. They can't like expect help from their neighbors, you know, a couple hundred miles away or whatever. They're seeking profit, but they don't know anything about the territory. All of those things make for like, we should definitely not be betting on England. But of course, we should be betting on England because we have the benefit of knowing how it all turns out, which is that the English colonies are going to win. America. Okay, so let's set that aside then.